So to kick things off, we're going to talk about UCD, or user-centered design. And it's probably a term that you've come across, but what's the difference between UX design, user experience, and overall design? So it's just a really good example here. And a quick definition: a person's perceptions and responses that result from the use or anticipated use of a product, system, or service. And that's really user experience. And you can see a really good example here of how a particular system, in this case a footpath, was designed with with a constructor in mind. So they didn't think about necessarily how the user was going to use this particular. In effect, it's a user interface, because it's how the user is able to walk through the process. And in this case, they just cut the corner off. And the real world use case is that this often happens, doesn't it? So we always need to think about the user whenever we design a digital product or service. And designing your emails, or designing your digital products, your websites, anything that you think about, your campaigns, for example, internally, you need to just always think about the user. Who are your personas? And we're going to be covering that off a little bit later on. So what is UX design? So UX design is everything from the product's look and feel to how it responds when the users interact with it, right through to the way it fits into their daily lives. And you can often impact a user's daily life through a really good quality user experience, and you probably come across those when you've been interacting with different things, different computer interfaces or different interfaces. So just a really good example here of the difference between product or user focused. And the Heinz ketchup bottle was designed in a certain way for years and years, and then an experienced designer or a user experience designer suddenly thought there might be a better way of doing this. And what they did was they kind of turned it on its head, literally, and made the bottle plastic and squeezable. And that had a significant impact on how people interacted with their ketchup bottle. So on a fundamental level, you can really impact on people's daily lives with good user experience design. And most organizations out there nowadays, and there's just an example here of Google, focus on the user. And there's just a quote here: focus on the user and all else will follow. And their whole sort of thought process is, if we design something that people want and people are happy to interact with, then it's going to really have a significant impact on the bottom line. There's a guy called Don Norman, and he invented the term user experience design. And it's just a quote from him here that says, "I invented the term because I thought human interface and usability were too narrow. I wanted to cover off all aspects of the person's experience with a system including industrial design, graphics, the interface, physical interaction, and the manual." So what's the difference between UX, CX, UI? Do you know what the terms mean? So UX, user experience; CX, customer experience; and UI, user interface. And you probably, during your day-to-day lives, have heard a little bit about the different terminologies, but it's always good to just define what they are. So most designers directly influence the user experience, but they also need to understand the larger context of customer experience. And the user experience is really the user or customer's experience with a specific product or service. The design of the interface, its usability, information architecture, etc., right through to things like navigation, and that could be a positive or negative experience. And there's just a nice little graphic here which shows you the difference between UX and UI. And there's a big sort of crossover in the Venn diagram here. And that crossover is really all about things like wireframing, prototyping, usability, accessibility, and they all impact the user interface design. And the user interface is the actual physical design that you see in your end product or service, and that's things like visual design. It's the color, the layout, the branding, etc. And the user experience design is often the stuff that you don't see behind the scenes that kind of builds into the process that enables people to design the end interface. And the customer experience represents every step of the journey, from when users compare products to actually calling customer services if their needs aren't met. So it encompasses all of that the UI, UX, but it also covers things like the sales process and sort of delivery and anything that has a touch on that end consumer. So I think that's quite a nice explanation, and ultimately it can cover off all different channels. So I think it's worth just talking about some UX design principles, and we have a few UX design principles that we follow whenever we design digital products or services. And number one is always design for your target audience. Number two, take the organization's goals into account. So, a designer may have certain ideas about how a digital product or service might look, or an email or what have you, but ultimately the organization is the person paying the bill. So we need to make sure that the overall objectives are met whenever we're designing a digital product or service. We make it easy to learn or use. So, it's got to be intuitive whenever we design our digital product or service. And, we ultimately want to make it satisfying and pleasant. So we want to be able to help users interact with that process. And obviously, the human experience is the highest priority. So, making sure that it works well for the end user is a really high priority. So, visual design is ultimately what we see. So it's the bit on the top of the tip of the iceberg, in effect. But there's a sort of broader piece here, and there's a whole piece behind the scenes, which is really what we don't see. And on the surface of the whole sort of UX design process, we can see visual design, and that's sort of the end product, if you like. But that only makes up about 10% of the process. And beneath the surface, we've got interface design, which is all about producing the skeleton structure, the navigation, the information design. So how it's all going to be put together. Then we start thinking about how people actually interact with it, and how we can sort of structure the overall content architecture, the information architecture that goes onto the page. Then we get into thinking about functional specifications, content requirements, all that sort of stuff. And beneath the process, normally towards the beginning of the process, we start thinking about the strategy, who are the users, what are your overall objectives for that site, that email, etc. So it kind of starts at the bottom and works its way up in terms of priorities. Next, we're going to cover off another part of the process, and we're going to have a bit more of a deep dive into the whole sort of user experience design process.